What's up, Life Science? We are going to start chapter 21, Energy. And so, first, we are going to touch on the respiratory system, and then we're going to go into the digestive system. All right, so respiratory system, some of the key things that we're going to talk about. Hold on. All right. The anatomy of the respiratory system, the physiology of the respiratory system, and then the respiratory system disorders. We discussed when we started the human body about anatomy and physiology. So anatomy is going to be, the structure of the respiratory system, and then the physiology is how that works, right? And how that anatomy, how it functions, and what it does in the human body is what the physiology is. All right, so the respiratory system supplies a vital substance to your body, which is oxygen. Obviously, when we breathe in, we're breathing in oxygen. And then when we exhale, that carbon dioxide is going out. The circulatory system is the body's transport system, and so it's going to transport that oxygen. The primary function is exchanging carbon dioxide and oxygen, through our airways, through our lungs. And then the lungs are the main organ of the respiratory system. I mean, there's some support organs that go along with it, but that's going to be the main one. So the air that you inhale, so that's when you breathe in, is going to be a source of oxygen. And so when the oxygen comes into the lungs, you are going to exhale or breathe out that carbon dioxide that is not needed. The oxygen is what is needed for our cells to be able to function. And we talked about that before, how hemoglobin in the blood cells, the red blood cells, holds on to those oxygen molecules and is going to transport it throughout the whole body to all the tissue and organs and all the things in our body that need oxygen to be able to function properly. All right. So, the anatomy of the respiratory system. So, air enters your body through either your nostrils or your mouth. You can breathe through either one or both. The membranes that line the nose secrete a thick, sticky mucus. And so that substance, that mucus, it helps a lot. We had talked about when we were talking about the immune system. I said when you breathe in stuff, mucus can grab a hold to pathogens and stuff and get rid of them before they even enter our body. And so that's one of our first lines of defense towards any kind of pathogens or bacteria is that mucus as well. That sticky mucus traps dust and other substances, again, that are floating in the air. And then cilia on the cells of those membranes, which we've talked about when we first done cells in the beginning of the year, and that's those little hair-like pieces that are on cells that help movement and help to grab and trap things. They line the respiratory tract, and so they move the mucus towards the throat where it can be swallowed. And so then it'll go down into the digestive system. All right, so here is an example of some, this is some tissue that is in the respiratory system or lines it. And you can see here that you've got the connective tissue, and then you've got the epithelial tissue, which is going to be that upper tissue. And then the nuclei is going to be inside of there, and then it has little pores that secrete the mucus. Those are the cells that do that, and then all those little tiny hairs are the cilia that help move that mucus through there so it can be swallowed. And it just helps with, food and stuff passing through as well, so it can pass through easier. If there wasn't anything there to kind of lubricate that airway and that throat, that would cause friction as well and make it harder to swallow and stuff. And so really that mucus is there to help. So at the back of the mouth and the nose is the part of the throat called the pharynx. So if you open your mouth real wide and you look in the mirror, if you look at the very back of your throat, you will see that that's where the pharynx starts. And so, when you swallow food, that's the first place it's going to hit before it goes down. And then also when you're breathing in, air goes into the pharynx first. After you leave the pharynx, you're going to go into the esophagus, and that's an elastic tube that is located behind the larynx, and that carries food and liquids to the stomach. It says elastic tube really because you got to think, like, if you are like swallowing food and maybe you didn't chew it up well, it's got to be able to expand, and so there's got to be some give there. So that's why it's elastic-like, so it can stretch depending on the amount of food that is going down. The larynx is the box-like structure, and it's also called a voice box. And so that's where you're gonna, actually get the sound of your voice from echoes there. And sometimes when you are stopped up or you have mucus that's in that larynx, you sound like you're hoarse a little bit. And so that kind of muffles the sounds that the voice box makes. Between the pharynx and the larynx, there is a flap of tissue called the epiglottis, and it covers the opening of the larynx. And so what happens is when you swallow food and liquids and stuff, to keep it from going into the airway, into the lungs, that little flap will close. So as you swallow, it automatically closes. And so the food and stuff can pass through without going into the airway. Now, sometimes, maybe if you're like laughing or, you cough or something as you're swallowing, sometimes because of multiple functions happening, it doesn't close all the way, and so you could get like liquid or something in the airway, and if that does happen, you're going to start coughing. I'm sure you guys have heard the saying, it went down the wrong pipe, and that's what that means, is if you get liquid or food in to that airway there, the first line of defense for that is to start coughing so it doesn't go down into your lungs and really cause some issues. Alright, and then a separate structure is called a uvula, and that's a small flap that hangs at the back of the throat. So if you open your mouth real wide and you see like that little flap, like that little, I don't know, it's like a piece of skin or whatever kind of dangling down, that little ball that's dangling down, that is your uvula. It's at the back of the throat, and it keeps food from going up into the nostril cavity. So you don't want food coming up. And sometimes, like if you start to drink something somebody makes you laugh, sometimes like it'll go up into your nose or whatever drink. I'm sure you guys have heard of people or seen videos on YouTube or whatever, funny videos of like people having like milk and stuff coming out of their nose. That's what happens, because when you laugh and there's multiple things happening, multiple functions, when you laugh, air is being forced upwards, and so when that happens, those flaps and things don't work properly, and so that'll cause things to go into the nasal cavities, drink or whatever. Or again, if the epiglottis doesn't close like it should, it'll cause liquids and foods to go into your airway. Alright, so a pair of folds inside the larynx can pull together and completely cover the opening of the lungs. This space between those folds are called the glottis. If something other than air tries to pass through, it's going to immediately cause you to cough. And again, that's so no damage or anything happens by food or drink or whatever. The folds around that glottis are called the vocal cords. And so the vibrations that come off of those cords is what makes our voice sound the way that it does. Since the larynx contains the vocal cords, it is often again called the voice box, because those vocal cords are inside of that larynx. All right. So at the bottom of the larynx opening is the trachea, or the windpipe, which is an open tube made of a series of cartilage rings. In the chest, the trachea branches to form two similar but smaller air passages called the bronchi. And each bronchus carries air to the lungs. And so you're going to have the trachea that goes down again into the or the windpipe, and then it branches off, and then we're getting closer to the lungs at this point. Inside the lungs, the bronchi branch and rebranch to form bronchioles, and then the air passes through those bronchioles and enters little microscopic sacs, and those are called the alveoli. And so all of those little sacs that are in there, those air passages, is what the oxygen is going into the lungs. Alright, so here is an example of it. Okay, so for one thing, right here, this flap will close again when you swallow, so you don't get anything into that windpipe, into the trachea. And so right here it kind of shows you where that is. So at this point, if you're breathing, it's going to go into the trachea. If you are swallowing food, it's going to go into the esophagus. And then the trachea goes down, and again it's little rings, and then that's when it branches off into the lungs, and you're going to get into the bronchi, and it goes into the lungs itself, into all those little microscopic little alveoli, which the oxygen is there, and then also capillaries are there. And then, this is what causes us to breathe out carbon dioxide once it's got the oxygen molecule that it needs. All right, so physiology of the respiratory system. Gases in the air passes through one cell thick walls of both the alveoli and the capillaries to enter the blood. We've talked about capillaries before. They're so microscopic and thin that gases passes right through those, and those are located there. This exchange of gases does not depend on how hard you breathe, but it operates on the principles of diffusion. And what diffusion means is that it is going to travel to places where, it's really going to just pass through areas. And so once it passes through those capillaries, it gets into the blood. We just got done with the heart chapter, and so when that blood comes from the heart and goes into the lungs, and the oxygen passes through those capillaries, and goes into it, then that oxygenated blood is what goes back into the heart to be, shipped out to all the tissues and all the cells that need it inside of the body. And so it's just passing through there. All right. Alright, so let's talk about breathing as a process of inhaling and exhaling air. You inhale by making your chest cavity larger, and so when you inhale, like your chest goes up. You make your chest larger by contracting your diaphragm. And so that is a muscle, when we talked a little bit about that previously in other chapters, but it's a muscle that is underneath your lungs. And so when it expands, when it gets larger, it pushes the lungs upward there, and then it pushes your chest out. And then once it goes back to normal, then it will, it pushes the air out, like when you exhale. And then when you breathe in, or when you fill up your lungs, it gives more room in that chest cavity, so you'll have room for those lungs. And so really without that diaphragm, it would be very hard to breathe. I mean, it would cause a lot of issues if that diaphragm wasn't working properly. That dome-shaped muscle is attached to lower ribs. It is attached to the backbone, and then also the sternum. And so those are some of the bones that we had learned about when we were doing the human skeleton. Alright, so here, So we have got, all right, so we're inhaling, and so that means that we're filling up those lungs right there, and so it actually moves downward, so it gives more room in the chest cavity. And then once you are going to exhale, it needs to push it out, and so that muscle is going to move upward, so it's going to force the air out of the lungs when you exhale. Alright, so lung volume, it says when you exhale, the diaphragm relaxes, pushes the muscles of the abdomen inward and upward, and pushes the diaphragm into its dome shape. And so then it makes the thorax, which is the chest cavity, smaller. When resting, a person usually inhales and then exhales about 50 mLs of air with each breath. So the maximum amount of air a normal pair of lungs can hold is about 5,500 mLs. And so that's what the lung capacity is for a set of lungs. And so here it says extra air that can be inhaled is 3,000. Air that is normally inhaled or exhaled is just 500 mLs. Extra air that can be exhaled is 1,000, and then air that cannot be exhaled is 1,000, because I mean your lungs have to stay inflated. I'm sure you guys have heard tales of, you know, people, like when you get in accidents and trauma, sometimes if you have a lung that collapses, that means that there's no air in it, so it needs to be pumped back up. So a certain amount of air has to stay in there anyway, just to keep them inflated. Alright, so this is again just a summary of what we just talked about with the capacity of the lungs. Alright, and so some disorders that can happen with the respiratory system. Pneumonia is an infection that causes the alveoli to become inflamed, and they fill with fluid. So pneumonia can be pretty bad. You can hear a lot of wheezing with pneumonia as well, and so when there's a lot of fluid on the lungs, obviously the lungs, you want air in there, you don't want fluid. Tuberculosis is a bacterial infection that results in clumps or damages of lung tissue, and it makes it hard where you can't exchange gases. Emphysema is a lung disease often associated with smoking that causes the walls of the alveoli to become stiff and less elastic, and so that means that air can't really exchange through those walls as good as it should, and it causes you'll have difficulty breathing, and then your body's not getting the amount of oxygen that it needs. And then again, I told you guys a collapsed lung, which occurs when, you know, that air is lost in there. And then sometimes you can even have like a hole in the chest, and that's also what can cause a collapsed lung. Alright, so, and this is just common cold cures. It says when a person with a cold sneezes or coughs, he spreads the cold virus, and it's kind of where we're at right now with everything going on in the world. The virus travels through the air, and other potential victims breathe it in. So that's why you're seeing people with masks and everything else going around, because it is something that, you know, bacteria and viruses, they're going to stay in air particles, and you know, when you breathe, or if somebody coughs or sneezes, there's actually you know, liquid coming out, and, you know, mucus and different things that has that bacteria on it, and so it can stay in air particles for a little while. A virus is a teeny strand of DNA or RNA surrounded by a coat of protein. And then a viral infection begins when a virus enters the host cell, and the best treatment for most viruses is rest. I told you guys before, you know, when we had talked about viruses in the past, when we were in the bacteria chapter, viruses hang on to good cells, and they inject, you know, lethal substances into it, and it ends up killing those host cells after that cell duplicates the virus for them. And so, you know, hopefully, especially at you guys' age, you know, the immune system is going to come in and fight the white blood cells and stuff and fight it off, and so eventually, you know, it'll take care of it, and then if you were to ever come in contact with it again, you know, your body will recognize it, and you know, will fight it off immediately. So, you know, just make sure you guys are taking vitamin C and, you know, just trying to stay away from everything that's going on right now, because really, I mean, the immune system will do what it needs to do if it's strong, and so it'll take care of what's going on. Alright, so cold and flu viruses are exceptionally hard to control because they frequently mutate, and again, you know, when the viruses hook onto those host cells, the host cells are duplicating the virus, so, you know, it'll kill the host cell and then it'll spread even more. There are many different viruses that can cause common colds, and scientists have not been able to develop a vaccine that protects against all of them. There are vaccines out there that can protect against some viruses, and hopefully with this one we've got going on right now, you know, it'll find something, some kind of vaccine or medication that'll help with the side effects of it. But, you know, just kind of staying clear of it and getting rest is about all you can do right now, and just be safe about it. But anyhow, so that is the end of the respiratory system. You guys can do the activity that I gave you guys out of the lab manual. And if you have any questions, text me. Bye.